Hello, everyone. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is John Young. I'm the Director of Counseling, and we're pleased to have a special guest with us to talk about the standardized testing world, SATs and ACTs, to take or not to take. So it is my pleasure to introduce our principal, Mr. John Serafine, who has over 40 years of experience in secondary education at Victor High School, Fairport, and most recently McQuaid. But I don't think there's anybody around the Rochester area who knows more about SATs than Mr. Serafine. So he's the perfect person to lead us in this conversation this evening. Let me turn it over to you, Mr. Serafine.
John, thank you. And thank you for tipping off my age. I appreciate that too, and my 8 million years of experience now. No, but thank you. And I appreciate the welcome, and I appreciate being included on this. I enjoy doing this. Um, so let me talk a little bit, since you mentioned my background. Let me maybe give you a little bit of a sense of where I come from when I talk about SATs and standardized testing in general. Like John said, this is my 46th year in education. I spent the vast majority of my career as a college counselor at Fairport High School, and then moved over here to McQuaid and was a college counselor here. And during all those times, in addition to being a college counselor, I do a ton of private SAT tutoring. I've taught multiple SAT prep classes throughout the area, still do, and I run a summer program at Nazareth called Camp College Prep, which is a heavy focus on SAT and ACT. So one of the reasons I say this to let you know that I've seen the SAT and ACT and the results and effects of standardized testing from a lot of different angles. And I'm probably the only nerdy person in the world that's seen every SAT that's been published for the last 35 years or so. So I feel like I have a pretty good handle on SAT, ACT, and its uses. So let me do this. Let me start by talking about the different tests that are out there. That our kids are exposed to. And they begin with the PSAT, which is just basically a practice or a preliminary SAT. We offered that here in October. Most of we probably had like 175 of our juniors and sophomores took that test. The PSAT is just a shorter, more condensed version of the SAT. It is now a fully digital exam. It started last year, the PSAT in that format. And like I said, it's a practice test. So low pressure, the results of the PSAT go nowhere other than students get a copy of their scores, and you receive as counselors a copy of their scores. PSATs are not sent to colleges. They're not listed on a student's permanent record or transcript or report card. It's merely a practice test. It's also a qualifying test for a pretty prestigious scholarship called the National Merit Scholarship. All right, so on a typical year, just to give you a frame of reference, we would have somewhere between 2 and 5 students who, based solely on their PSAT performance, qualify for National Merit Scholarships. So like I said a minute ago, the PSAT mirrors the SAT. There's essentially 2 parts on the PSAT. There's a reading and writing section, and there's a math section. They do not have to write anything. There are no essays involved. It's an entire multiple choice test. So, and the PSAT is scored on a scale of 320 to 1520, which is a little bit different than the SAT. So I talked a little bit about National Merit Scholarships. So essentially what they do, and if you have a child who took the PSAT, this number might make sense to you. On the score report, the students get a number that's called a selection index number. And what they do is they take their reading and writing score twice, and they add their math score to it, and that's their selection index score. And every year, the selection index cutoff for National Merit Scholarships varies from year to year and from state to state. New York State, the number typically tends to be fairly high, and it usually hovers around 220. So if your son took the PSAT in October, he now has his scores back. You may want to take a peek at that selection index. But again, we offer that at an optional basis to all our sophomores and juniors. It was given in October. The kids received their scores back probably about a month ago. Right? Then there's the more common test that people are more familiar with is the SAT and its sister, the ACT. Let's talk a little bit about the SAT. The SAT has changed formats several times over the last 10, 12 years. Most recently, last year when the SAT went to a fully digital format. So students who now take the SAT, the only option that they have is to take it on the computer. It's a much shorter test. I think it's a much more user-friendly test for students. They have probably like 50 fewer questions to tackle than they had in the previous test. It's about an hour shorter than the previous version of the SAT. It's now about 2 hours and 15 minutes from start to finish. That's a good thing. And again, no essay, all multiple choice, with the exception of a handful of math questions that are what they call student produced responses, where there are no multiple choices. They have to solve the problem and bubble in the actual number or the answer. Um, Most of our students will take the SATs once in the spring of their junior year and again in the fall of their senior year. That's not mandatory, but that's typically when kids take that. And I'll talk more about the time frame a little bit. But again, that's been a pretty significant change, excuse me, with the SAT being fully digital. It's also now what they call adaptive test, which is a little bit confusing. So essentially, kids will take module 1 of the SAT reading and writing. And based on their performance on module 1, determines if they move on to module 2A or module 2B. Module 2A will be the harder of the two. Excuse me. Module 2B will be the less difficult of the two modules. So your performance on module 1 is very important. And you want to perform well enough to move on to the more difficult module 2A. If you don't, and you move into the less difficult module 2B, your score is going to be capped. You're only going to be able to reach a certain point. Right? So I know it sounds a little bit counterproductive, but so the kids who do well on module 1, they get the beautiful gift of being able to take the more difficult module 2B. So that's called adaptive testing, and that's a relatively new concept for the SAT. Then there's the ACT, excuse me, which for years was kind of the lesser known test in the country. Most kids on the East Coast took the SAT. The ACT was predominantly a Midwest, West Coast test. Now, quite frankly, more kids in the United States take the ACT every year than take the SAT. So the ACT and SAT are big business rivals. The ACT is different. It has 4 sections where the SAT only has 2. The ACT has a reading section, it has an English section, it has a math section, and it has a science section, scored on a scale of 1 to 36. So that is changing also this April. So basically in response to the SAT changing the nature of its test, the ACT is sort of doing the same thing. So it's becoming a much shorter test. They're making the science section, which is unique. They're making that optional, so students will have a choice to take the science portion of the test or not. Which kind of begs the question, do you or do you not? And I think some schools will require it, some won't. I think for the kid who's going into a science-related field, obviously it would behoove them to take the science section of the ACT. Again, most of our students take the ACT in the spring of junior year and again fall of senior year. Now, my suggestion has always been to kids when it comes to which one do I take, SAT or ACT? My suggestion has been to most kids to take both of them, not to test them to death, but I think, to take a shot at the SAT and the ACT and see which experience is better for you. Your kids may take the ACT and say, yeah, it's not my strength. I really didn't like the science. Or if you think of it this way, the SAT, 50% of the SAT is math. 50 or 25% of the ACT is math. So if I'm a really strong math student, I think it would be beneficial for me to take the SAT, where 50% of my score is going to be math. Again, on the ACT, it's only 25%. So there's a little bit of difference between the tests. Like I said, ACT, in response to the changing format of the SAT, is sort of doing the same thing. All right, they're moving to a much shorter test, a fully digital test, and they're making their science portion optional. All right, so that's a big change between or with the ACT. Um, while we're on the list of tests that kids will be taking, let me also talk a little about the advanced placement test. So any of our students here at McQuaid who are taking an advanced placement course, that course will culminate with an AP exam that's administered in May of the year that that course is being taken. Um, AP scores or AP exams are scored on a scale of 1 to 5. Many schools, many colleges will award college credit for a class if the student receives a score of 4 or 5. Some dip as low as 3. That's a little bit unlikely. Um, AP scores do not show on students' report cards. They're not sent to colleges unless students request them to be sent. But all of our kids who take AP courses will take an AP exam at the end of their course. All right. Let me talk a bit about how these tests are used, because they're used in a variety of ways. They're used to they're used in admissions purposes, and oftentimes they're used for the awarding of financial aid. Let me talk about how they're used for admissions purposes, and we could do a full 2 hour, Zoom meeting on that topic alone. But I'll give you my kind of own unasked for opinion on this. Um, Transcripts are very, very hard for college admissions people to decipher. And I'm sure Mr. Young, after spending 30 years in the college admissions world, could attest to that. If you think of it this way, everyone's transcripts are different from high school to high school, from locally, nationwide, whatever. So here at McQuaid, we're on a 1 through 100 numerical scale where we weight our grades. So our kids who take advanced or AP exams, they get an additional 4% bump on their grade. Some schools are straight 1 through 100. When I was at Fairport High School, we were numerical, but we didn't weight any grades. So if you got a 92 on an AP biology, that was your grade. It wasn't bumped up at all. Some schools are on a letter systems, right, where they're A, B, C, D. Some are on a 4.0, some are on a 5.0. So my point is, it's very, very difficult for college admissions people to compare and decipher transcripts. It's not hard to decipher and compare SAT scores or ACT scores. It's a standardized test with a standardized score. So quite frankly, a student from Fairport High School who gets 1,000 on his or her SAT score and a guy from McQuaid gets a 1,400 on his SAT score, we could argue the relative merits of that forever, but there's a distinct difference between those two scores. And I, for one, and I may be in the minority of people in this country, I really believe that the standardized test scores are very good measures. And I think they do exactly what they're designed to do. They're not IQ tests by any stretch of the imagination. They're designed to measure a student's readiness to perform at the freshman level in college. That's the stated purpose of the test. And I, for one, think they do a beautiful job of that. Like you said, they're not IQ tests. And there are a lot of other variables that determine success in life, right? That aren't going to be measured on an SAT, right? Your work ethic, your resilience, your attitude, your ability to stick with something, right? Overcome obstacles. So there's a lot of things. But I think these tests do what they're supposed to do. And I really think that they truly do a good job measuring a high school student's readiness to tackle college level work. And that's why they're there, quite frankly. Um, it makes life a little bit easier, I think, for college admissions people when they have more data. Uh, and this is a pretty standardized piece of data that they can use. So yeah, I do think it's important, and that's how they're used. Um, I'm going to talk about pre-COVID in a couple minutes, but if you think about historically, what is the purpose of SAT scores and how are they used in college admissions offices? It was just that. It was another piece of data that was, like I said, standardized, an easy way to compare and sort students. In a sense, it still is. All right. So let me go back and talk a little bit pre-COVID, COVID, and now that we're post-COVID. So like I said, pre-COVID, a big piece of the puzzle, not the biggest piece, but a piece of the puzzle that was used in the college admissions world, alongside, the grade point average, the rigor of your curriculum, extracurricular activities, your level of interest in the school, the quality of your essay, the quality of letters of recommendation that people write on your behalf. All those were pieces of the puzzle, and the SAT, ACT score was a piece of that puzzle. COVID comes along and test centers are closed. Kids didn't have an opportunity to take tests. So a lot of colleges, or just about every college, they were forced to go test optional. Not that they chose to go test optional, right? So think about that. Prior to any college in this country who wanted to be test optional could have done so well before COVID. And several schools did in this area, Hobart William Smith, Nazareth College, those schools were test optional. They made a conscious effort to say, we feel that a student's transcript and other factors are more crucial in determining, college level success. So anyone could have done that, pre-COVID, but a lot of schools didn't. So COVID comes along, everyone goes, test optional because they had to. Then, COVID ends and people are still trying to figure out, do we stick with these test optional policies? Do we go back to what we used to have? And slowly and surely, the dominoes are starting to fall, right? Some of the Ivy League schools came out first and said, no, we're going to go back and we're going to make the submission of an SAT score, an ACT score requirement to apply. And usually when that happens, other schools start to fall in line. That's exactly what we're seeing. So even during test optional, I think it was a dangerous time for kids, and I think a confusing time for people who are applying to colleges. Because I think what happens is when people hear optional for something that's not fun, human nature says, hey, let's not do it. Like, I think if you said to your sons, hey, making your bed, we're going to be a make your bed optional household, I'm going to think most kids would take the stance and say, well, I'm going to opt out of that because it's not the most enjoyable task. So test optional, colleges weren't lying, and they're still not lying. Right? They're test optional. You do not have to take the test at these schools. They're saying that they're test optional. However, if you don't, again, that's just one less data point that colleges have when they're trying to assess and analyze your application. And quite frankly, what you're trying to do is stack up as many positives as you can. In a solid test score, I remember speaking to someone from Cornell said to me, it's basically considered a super activity. Right, it's another big strength that you have and a plus in your corner. And the same woman at Cornell had said to me, and I remember having this conversation during COVID, she said, we are test optional. She goes, a lot of things are optional, like being a good kid is optional. Being involved in your school, that's optional. Getting good grades, all those things are optional. But if you don't have them, it's a negative. And I think that's the same thing, excuse me, with test scores. So no one's lying to you when they say we're test optional. But all the data that we're seeing now and even during COVID strongly suggests that kids who submit scores are having much better success in the college admissions world than those who don't submit scores. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but if you look at it this way and you say, well, I'm not going to submit my scores. Well, then what do you think colleges are thinking, right? Obviously, they're thinking that there's a reason why you're not submitting your scores, and it's not because they were fantastic. It's because you weren't happy with them and you don't want them to see them. I always tell kids jokingly, it's like the equivalent of going on an online dating site and not putting your picture. There's probably a reason why you're not putting your picture there. Okay, so stupid example and analogy, but I think the point's well taken. So in this era that we're still in, it's still kind of quasi-test optional. My strong advice to most kids is just to forget that phrase even exists. Take the tests. Well, first of all, prepare for the tests. Take the tests. Take the test multiple times. Do the best you can. And now here's where the test optional part, I think, becomes advantageous for students. So now you've taken the tests. You have your scores. Then you decide whether you want to submit them or not. And that's a little bit more complex than it sounds. So let's say, a college is test optional. My first advice would be to the student is go to that college's website and see what their mid-50th percentile of test scores is. And you can find that very easily. You go on, you just Google University of Rochester, mid-50th percentile of SAT scores, their numbers will pop up. Let me use U of R for an example, and don't hold me to these numbers, but They won't be precise, but I'm sure they'll be fairly close. I'm going to guess if I went on the University of Rochester's website and said, what are your mid 50th percentile SAT scores? It's probably going to range somewhere from the mid 1300s, let's say 1340 to 1520. Like I said, making those numbers up. All right, so let's say I'm a student at McQuaid and I take the SATs and I get 1100. Maybe I've got a 96 grade point average here. I've taken rigorous courses, I've done a lot of good things. I get 1100 on my SATs. They're telling me that 50% of the students that they accept, those kids' SAT scores fall within that range of 1340 to 1520. I'd be crazy if I submitted my 1100 if they're giving me an out. All right, so I would not submit my SAT scores there. If it was close to the low end, because those scores are a little bit skewed, I would submit it. If I had like a 1300 and they're telling me their scores are from 1340 to 1520, I would probably still submit them. But if I had 1100, I absolutely would not. Now, on the other end, let's say I'm applying to, I don't know, let's say I'm applying to St. John Fisher University, and I Google their mid 50th percentile scores. And again, I'm making these numbers up, but let's say they fall between the range of 1050 to 1200. And I'm sitting there with my 1100 SAT score, and they're test optional. I'd be foolish not to submit it, right? Because I'm within their range of their mid 50th percentile scores. So that's a little bit overly simplified, but I think, I don't think it's a good idea to just uniformly say I'm submitting my test scores everywhere. I think you get your scores, do a little bit of research, talk with the college counselors here. We have plenty of data to look at, and then decide if it makes sense for you to submit or not submit your scores to the schools. But I think going blindly and saying, hey, they're test optional, therefore I'm just not going to take them, I don't think that's a great idea. And on the other end of that spectrum, I don't think it's a good idea to just say, I'm going to take them, submit them everywhere. I don't think that's a good idea either. So that's just my little spiel about, test optional. And I think withholding scores, it kind of adds an element of speculation. The colleges, they have to figure out, well, why did the student not submit his or her scores, right? And now we're well past COVID, where everyone, at McQuaid just had an opportunity, if they choose to take SATs or ACTs. You can't say, well, the test centers were closed, I couldn't do them. So if you don't submit them right now, that's your choice. And, it's a conscious choice that you're making. Okay. So let me go back a little bit to talk about when I say how are they used, right? Obviously, they're used in admissions, in the admissions world. They're also used in the awarding of financial aid. A lot of schools have internal merit scholarships. They're a part of the criteria or SAT scores. So oftentimes, I'll deal with a student who says, hey, I'm applying to school X, and my SAT scores fall well within the range of their mid 50th percentile, and so therefore I'm not going to take them again, which is makes sense. But oftentimes you don't understand. Let's say you're sitting there with a 1290 SAT score, and the school that you're applying to, maybe internally, has a $10,000 merit scholarship for kids who are in the top 10% of their class, have a 1300 SAT score and a grade point average of making up above 90 or whatever. All right, so now you opt not to take the SAT again because you're satisfied with your 1290. Had you taken it over again, gotten one or two more questions right, you bump up into that 1300 range. Do the math. It might have been worth about $40,000 worth of financial aid to you over the course of 4 years. So I always caution kids to ask that question, and I don't ever think there's really a negative or a disadvantage to taking the test multiple times. Super scoring, I'll just throw that term out. A lot of colleges super score, which simply means this: if you take the test 3 times or twice or 5 times or whatever, colleges are going to take your highest score, your highest reading score and your highest math score, even if they come from different test dates. So again, kid who take the test 3 times, they're going to pick your highest math score and pair it with your highest reading score. That's called super scoring, and that's obviously to students' advantage. So I want you to be aware of that also. Let me take a little bit of time here and talk about how to prepare for these tests, because it's something I spent a lot of time doing. I mentioned earlier, like I said, I tutor a lot and teach SAT prep classes. And I think oftentimes kids are underprepared to take these tests, and they're not easy tests. And as a parent, if you want to get humbled, I would encourage you to, go online, pull up a practiced SAT, and test your math skills and your language skills. They're difficult tests. Uh, and for years, I think the College Board said, you really can't prepare for these tests, but you absolutely can prepare for these tests, and you should. Um, so let me give you a couple just of my words of advice. The tests are very, very language heavy, and they're biased in favor of kids who read a lot. It's as simple as that. People talk about, oh, it's biased this way, it's biased that way. It's heavily biased in favor of kids who read a lot. So like I said, I tutor a ton of kids. And it doesn't take me a long time to figure out if a student is well read or not. And the reality is if you haven't read for the last 15, 16 years, you're at a disadvantage because your reading comprehension skills aren't going to be as strong. Your vocabulary is not going to be as extensive. You're not going to have a good grasp on the grammar rules that are so heavily tested on both of these tests. And the pace of your ability to take that test probably isn't where it needs to be. All right, so read anything you can get your grubby little hands on. They don't have to be classics. One of the most talented guys I used to work with, who was this incredibly gifted English teacher. Most of his life, he read Sports Illustrated magazines, and that's how his vocabulary grew. That's how his interest in reading grew. That's how his love for reading kind of took off. So it doesn't have, you don't have to sit down and read Shakespeare or every classic imaginable, but read. And it's never too late to start reading. Researchers tell you that if your reading patterns are pretty much developed by the time you're in 7th or 8th grade. And I think there's some truth to that, but I also think there's some truth to making a concerted effort to read more, and it would certainly help you on the SAT. A lot of the SAT questions come from 3 sources. They come from a magazine called The Economist. They come from the New Yorker, and they come from the New York Times. Your son probably won't be overly ecstatic when he finds The Economist magazine in his stocking on Christmas, but it's not a bad gift to give. So if you really want to dig deep and prepare well for these tests, that's the type of reading that you have to do. The Economist, New York Times, and the New Yorker. So those are 3 major sources of questions on the SAT. Kids have to grow their vocabulary. And, there's no longer a specific vocab section on the SAT, which there used to be. So, 7, 8 years ago, there was a section on, just difficult vocab, and they've done away with that. But, the mistake that people make is, there's no more vocabulary section, therefore I don't have to grow my vocabulary. Well, guess what's in all the reading sections? There's difficult vocabularies. So one of the first things I always do when I teach my SAT prep class is I give kids a page out of Newsweek magazine, which is, by the way, written for people who are waiting to have their teeth cleaned or going to the bathroom. And it's typically written at an 8th grade reading level, most of the articles. And I say to kids, I say, read this article. I just pick a random article, and I say, read the article and have a pen in your hand and poke a hole in any word that you don't know. And just be brutally honest. If you don't know a word, just poke a hole in that piece of paper. And I have them take like 15 minutes and read. And then I have them hold their paper up, and I say, that's what the essay gets. If your vocabulary is limited, that's what the SAT is going to look like for you. You're going to have holes all over because you're not going to understand words. So growing vocabulary is incredibly important. And how you grow your vocabulary is important also. I'm not a big fan of saying, hey, here's a vocab list of 1,000 words that happen to be on the SAT. Go and memorize it. That's not going to happen, nor should it. So I'm a big fan of root words. And, if after this presentation, anybody want to send your son in to get a root word list from me, I'd be happy to hand one to him. I have a root word list of about 250 root words. And I say to the kids, you learn these root words, you're basically growing your vocabulary exponentially. There was a word on the most recent SAT. It was called euphonic. It's EUPHONIC. And a couple of kids I was tutoring after the test said to me, I'd never heard that word before. I was like, well, of course you didn't, because no one ever uses that word. But if you broke it down, with root words, you would have been able to figure it out because the root word EU means good, right? If someone gives a eulogy, they're saying good words about someone. Um, if you're feeling euphoric, you're feeling good about something, right? So EU means good. PHON, right? Telephone, symphony orchestra, phonics, has something to do with sound. So quite simply, a word like euphonic means it sounds good. All right. So if you use that word here at the cafeteria table at lunchtime, you're going to have people scatter in a hurry because they're going to think, "Oh my God, what a freak this guy is!" Saying, "Hey, that music is really euphonic." It sounds a little bizarre. Um, but yeah, growing your vocabulary, learning root words is a great way to do that, and a very, very important thing to do. Taking practice tests. All research shows you that taking practice tests is the best way to prepare. Right? It just simply is. Being familiar with the test, understanding the pacing. If you sat down and spent some time doing this and looked at practice tests and really committed to doing it, after a while, you'd say, these are the same questions over and over and over again. And like you said, I've done this for a very long time. And because I've done it for a long time and received so many tests, I can almost predict what's coming next. All right. Because they're testing the same things, right? They're testing your vocab, your grammar skills, your ability to read with pace. All right. Let me talk a little bit about grammar skills. We do kids a disservice in education, in English education, because we really don't teach grammar anymore, right? Even at the higher levels, AP classes, most of it is literature based. Kids are reading novels and poetry and short stories, maybe getting a little bit of grammar, but not enough. So kids who walk into an SAT and don't have a solid mastery over grammar or over grammar rules get destroyed. A simple example, most kids have no idea how to use a semicolon, right? They just don't. And because of that, the College Board throws it on the SAT about 8 times at every single test, and I'm not exaggerating it. So if you don't know how to use a semicolon, you're going to struggle. And a semicolon simply allows you to join two related sentences. So I just tell kids quite simply, there has to be a complete sentence on each side of the semicolon, which then begs the question, like, what is a sentence? Which sounds simple enough. But a huge portion of the reading and writing part of the SAT is essentially testing whether or not kids know what a sentence is, right? What's a complete sentence? So kids will say to me, well, I have to have a subject and a verb. Well, it does, but I can put together a bunch of words that have a subject and a verb, but it's not a sentence. So for something to be a sentence, it has to have a complete thought. Simple as that. So I'll spare you all the boring grammar rules, but I just want to give you a flavor of what you have to know to perform well on that test. There's also these books out there. If you're looking for great Christmas presents, they're called Word Smart. There's Word Smart 1, there's Word Smart 2, there's Illustrated Word Smart. And they're just great, quick, easy ways for kids to grow their vocabulary as opposed to, like you said, being handed a list of 1,000 SAT words to learn, because that's not going to happen. Other ways to prepare. There's no shortage of, tutoring opportunities. There's no shortage of, the big box companies like Kaplan and Sylvan Learning Center and all those. There's a million ways that you can throw your money around to help prepare. There's also a lot of stuff you can do online that doesn't cost you a penny, right? Khan Academy, great website, great YouTube videos to help you prepare. College Board has stuff online. If you go online and Google SAT prep, you can find digital tests. Like I said, there's no shortage at all in resources. But having said that, I think the student who walks in this climate and in this day and age and is totally unprepared to take this test, hasn't prepared at all, has never taken a practice test, hasn't seen a test, hasn't gone through the timing of it, puts himself at a big disadvantage when coming to taking the test. And I know if you watch other presentations this week from the counseling department about College Information Week, you're going to hear colleges talk to you about trends in admissions and trends in testing and this test optional thing. So again, I'm just going to go back, and if you take anything away from my presentation, which is titled "To Take or Not Take the SAT," the short answer is take, because it can help you immensely. And I think in the absence of an SAT score, you run the risk of putting yourself in a tough spot on the SAT. So I'm going to close this by going back to what I said earlier about, taking the SAT, forget the optional part, prep for it, take it. When you're doing your research, you decide whether it makes sense for you to submit or not submit your scores to certain schools. That would be my strong advice. And like anything else, SAT prep is probably not the most enjoyable thing you can do, uh, but it's incredibly worthwhile. And it's something you have to commit to. Like kids got their PSAT scores back a few weeks ago. When I met with several kids who asked me about their scores, and I said to them, they weren't happy with their PSAT scores. And I said, I can tell you two things. One is, if you don't change your behavior around how you read and how you prepare for this test, your SAT scores are going to look very similar to your PSAT scores. And that doesn't mean you're a terrible human being. But if you just keep doing what you've been doing, you read the same amount, you don't take practice tests, you don't grow your vocabulary, you don't make it your business to learn the grammar rules, I can tell you with a ton of confidence that your SAT scores are going to look very, very similar to your PSAT scores. And that's okay if that's where you are. The second thing I would tell you is if you're not happy with your scores and you want to improve, you can do so. But you have to change your behavior around how you approach this, right? Like I said, you have to learn root words. You have to take practice tests. You have to read more. You have to grow your vocabulary. You better learn 15 grammar rules and know them solid. And I gave you a couple, right? You better know how to use a semicolon. You better know how to use a colon. You have to know that you can't join two sentences with a comma. You have to know what a sentence looks like. What the complete sentence has to have a complete thought, etc. Right. So again, it takes time, it takes work, it's well worth it. In having a solid SAT score as part of your college application package goes a long way, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. So I hope that was helpful. If I can ever be of service to you, don't hesitate. In my role as principal, I really miss my role as college counselor, and I love helping kids prepare for SAT and ACT. I always have. So, John, thank you for having me, and I hope that was helpful.
Mr. Serafine, that was perfect. And as a former admissions officer, I couldn't agree with you more on all your points. And we're happy to help students as they navigate this to help decide where to submit their scores and where not to, looking at the mid 50% bands and looking at our history at McQuaid with those colleges. So I think that's great advice.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you. I think our kids are in really good hands with you and Mr. Griffin and Miss Galato upstairs, and I'm sure the kids will take advantage of all your expertise. So thank you. And thanks again for including me tonight. I appreciate that.
Thank you.